Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Noel Neill, who died recently at the age of 95. And if you're not sure who Noel Neill is, this will be a little reminder.
Yes, this is Lois Lane, Demon Reporter.
Noel Neill was the first Lois Lane and the most memorable Lois Lane. She was born in Minneapolis, daughter of a journalist who wanted her to become a reporter, and I guess you could say she did. In between, she wrote for Women's Wear Daily, she did some singing in Hollywood, and she was the #2 pinup girl in World War II after Betty Grable. She started working on the Adventures of Superman serials in the late 1940s with Kirk Alyn as Superman, and then she moved to the Adventures of Superman with George Reeves after Phyllis Coates did the role for 1 year and moved on to do other things. Since we talked about the Adventures of Superman television series recently when we did the obit of Jack Larson, Jimmy Olsen, we're going to confine our Noel Neill stuff primarily to the serials she did with Kirk Alyn before it moved to TV. In 2010, the city of Metropolis, Illinois, erected a statue of her in their municipal Superman tribute, and they created a sort of a fake documentary with a little biography.
Wonder presents Metropolis News. Noel Neill, American actress of television and motion pictures, was celebrated with the unveiling of a bronze statue in her likeness, towering nearly 6 feet, at the 32nd annual Superman celebration in Metropolis, Illinois. Born on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1920, to David and Laverne Neill. Her father, a respected Minneapolis newspaperman and editor for the Star Tribune, wanted her to become a reporter, and sure enough, she did. First, singing at the Del Mar Racetrack restaurant where she was discovered by Bing Crosby, and later appearing in films for MGM, RKO, and Warner Brothers. In 1948, Columbia Pictures set out to make a film serial entitled Superman, starring Kirk Alyn in the title role. They needed a Lois Lane. David Neill, Noel's father, finally got his wish, and Noel was cast in the now legendary role of the ace reporter. So successful, the two appeared together again in the 1950 production of Man vs. Superman. By 1951, The Adventures of Superman had come to television, starring George Reeves. Not to be left out, Noel Neill would soon join him as Lois Lane, working side by side with his alter ego. In 1977, Warner Brothers began production of Superman, the movie, starring Christopher Reeve, and in a surprising turn would appear as Lois Lane's mother, alongside Kirk Alyn, stating,
Lois Lane, you have a writer's gift for invention.
Other appearances would follow, but none more loved and adored by her fans than The Adventures of Superman. Never to be forgotten, Noel Neill has forever been immortalized as the titular character, Lois Lane, who, alongside Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
Yeah, we could definitely use a little more of that battle for truth, justice, and the American way. Here she talks about how she first got the role. Sam Katzman was the guy who developed the Superman serial for the movies.
I got the part. I had actually worked for Sam Katzman before in some other series, and so when my agent came by, with the little thing with all the girls in it, and no, she'll be fine, she can talk.
These newfangled typewriters.
It was really that simple. In fact, I had to buy a Lois Lane comic book to find out what she looked like, because I didn't know.
Noel Neill was a really nice woman. She had a good relationship with both Kirk Alyn and George Reeves off screen. Here she talks a little bit about Kirk Alyn as the first Superman.
Kirk was so good at, like from his ballet, leaping out, that you could almost believe that he was continuing flying.
And they used to ask Noel Neill all the time, how come she didn't recognize that Clark Kent was Superman with that meager disguise? And she said, you don't want me to lose my job, do you? Her death leaves Phyllis Coates as the only survivor from the 1950s television Superman series.
Ready?
Always.
Well, we're going to move on now to our feature tonight, Sidney Schanberg, who died recently at the age of 82. He was the Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for the New York Times, who's best known for his coverage of the killing fields in Cambodia, the genocide perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979 in the vacuum of when the United States left Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge were the Cambodian communists who killed 2 million out of 7 million Cambodians. They basically emptied the cities, turned it into a rural agrarian community, and perpetrated one of the worst massacres of the 20th century. We talked about the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian massacre before when we did Deutsch, who was one of the perpetrators of the massacre, but Sidney Schanberg was the journalist most responsible for reporting it to the United States, along with his compatriot, the Cambodian Dith Pran. In 1984, only 5 years after the last year of the massacre, they made an excellent movie of the story of Sidney Schanberg and Dith Pran, The Killing Fields, where Sidney Schanberg was played by Sam Waterston. I don't generally like Sam Waterston, but he did an excellent job there. Here is Matthew Bannister of the BBC for Last Word on Sidney Schanberg.
Sidney Schanberg was the award-winning foreign correspondent for the New York Times, whose story was told in the film The Killing Fields. In 1975, as the brutal Khmer Rouge regime swept to power in Cambodia, Sidney and his translator Dith Pran reported on the violence. But when Sidney was evacuated, he had to leave Pran behind. The regime moved millions of people from the cities into the countryside, where many of them died from ill treatment, starvation, and overwork.
To many Westerners it seemed a paradise, another world, a secret world. But the war in neighboring Vietnam burst its borders, and the fighting soon spread to neutral Cambodia.
Sidney's friend and former New York Times colleague, Charles Kaiser.
He was a man of extraordinary intensity, and he also was someone who cared deeply about the state of the world, and his great talent as a reporter was that he could make everyone who was reading him feel as passionately about a subject as he did.
It is clear that the collapse of Phnom Penh is only hours away. Enormous fires from the battles that ring the very edge of the city turn the night sky orange. The last government planes, single-engine propeller craft, diving low over the treetops, futilely try to halt the communist advance with their final bombs.
Journalists and foreign residents were told to assemble at the U.S. Embassy before 9. The decision was to close down the entire U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh.
A lot of correspondents left as the Khmer Rouge stormed to power. What made Sidney decide to stay?
It was his probably sense of competitiveness above all, and he had been filing what were really the most exciting dispatches I had ever read. He knew what kind of impact those stories were having, and I think he didn't want to stop filing them. Unlike everybody else, he ignored the orders of his editors and stayed on.
A New York Times reporter and his interpreter would learn the price of survival.
How did he come to be working with Dith Pran?
Well, Dith Pran, I think, was already working for the New York Times in Cambodia. He probably inherited him from a previous correspondence there.
Pran and I bonded, and I began to realize that he was just as obsessed a reporter, just as determined and driven as I was.
Dith saved his life at least once, probably more than once, talking them out of extremely dicey situations with the Khmer Rouge.
Sidney and Dith Pran took refuge in the French embassy, but only foreign nationals were allowed to stay there. So to Sidney's great distress, Pran and the other Cambodians were expelled from the compound.
There was absolutely nothing he could do. The French said, if you keep him, you jeopardize everyone else who's here, and there is no choice. And it was the most horrible moment of his life, and he continued to live that horrible moment pretty much continuously for the next 4 years of his life.
Because he didn't know what had happened to Dith, and in amongst the millions who died, he must have assumed that Dith had died too.
Well, I don't know if he ever assumed that. You know, I met him a year after he had left Dith at the embassy, and on great naivete, I said, whatever happened to Dith? And he looked horrified and sort of drew himself up and said, someday he will come out. Because if he did not have that faith, he wouldn't have been able to function at all. And even with that faith, functioning was very difficult. He went through long periods where he couldn't face anyone, even his own family.
It must have been a very difficult time because he was being showered with awards. He won the Pulitzer Prize. But those prizes must have been very bittersweet.
Very bittersweet indeed. I mean, he was really just a deeply unhappy man until 1979 when he finally gets a message, tell Sidney Schanberg I'm still alive. It's a message that will make him happy.
I bet it did. How did Sidney talk about receiving that message?
He said they were the 8 most exquisite words he'd ever heard in his life.
Around the corner comes Pran, and he's hobbling because his diet, was so bad. couldn't run. And then I started to run, and then he ran into my arms, and he just threw his legs around my waist, and we just hugged for, I don't know how long. I said, after a while, "Can you forgive me for not getting you out?" There's nothing to forgive. I'm awfully glad that they kept that scene exactly as it was.
The killing fields.
U.S. bombs, you sure?
I think many, many times. I don't know.
That's a rumor now. I'm not going to comment on a rumor.
What did he make of the movie?
He was extremely happy with the movie and extremely relieved that it was so genuine.
Nobody gets to go in there. If I thought I could, I would.
Could he be a difficult man to work with? Could he be a difficult man to work for?
He was an incredibly loyal person, but he was certainly not an easy person. Far better to work for him than to be covered by him if you were a corrupt politician or an incompetent general. That would be the most unpleasant experience that you could have.
Apart from the writing from Cambodia, what are the other pieces of reporting that stand out for you?
Well, really the great cause of his life for the last 20 years was the question of whether or not the United States left behind a lot of American soldiers who were missing in action at the end of the Vietnam War. And this was something that he wrote about over and over again. And it was the great frustration, really, of the last 20 years of his life that he could never convince any mainstream outlet to take up this story, which really consumed him.
What do you think was the key to his character?
It was a belief in the power of journalism to make the world a better place and the power of journalism to call attention to oppressed people wherever they were. He really, as much as anyone I ever knew, believed that a journalist's main function was to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted.
Charles Kaiser on Sidney Schanberg.
Maybe you didn't catch that little phrase there early on where he said, "Many Cambodians died of ill treatment, starvation, and overwork." Hey, the Khmer Rouge clubbed, beat, tortured, and cut hundreds of thousands of people to death out of those millions. It wasn't just ill treatment and overwork. Our anti-war left in America, those Jane Fonda types, have always been a little reluctant to acknowledge the Holocaust of the Khmer Rouge, which was part of the other side of the fight in Vietnam. And I personally give Sidney Schanberg a lot of credit for being one of the only leftist liberals to make a big issue of what the Khmer Rouge did. Well, we're going to close tonight with Jim Hickman, who died recently at the age of 79. One of my favorite ball players from back in the day. When I was working at Wrigley Field, he was on the Cubs. Jim Hickman was born in the little town of Henning, Tennessee. And the irony is the two main teams he played for were the big city teams. He was part of the original Mets in 1962, and he was part of the Cubs in 1969 and 1970. He was a good outfielder, but slow, but he became a very good hitter, especially in his 30s, and he helped carry the Cubs with a lot of home runs in 1969 and 1970. He's also noted for being the guy who got the hit in the All-Star game that caused the collision between Ray Fosse and Pete Rose. Here are a couple of clips from Hickman's career.
Bottom of the 12th, when Charlie Hustle rounded third looking to score on a Jim Hickman single. And suddenly, Ray Fosse was all that stood between Rose and a National League win.
The Cubs outfield, Jimmy Hickman had a great year. How do you account for that fine finish he had in '69?
Well, Jimmy, if it hadn't been for Hickman last year, I think we would wind up in fourth place because Jimmy, he did a tremendous job for us, and I think all the ball players on our ball club take their hats off to Jim Hickman.
Well, hit ball back to right field. Somebody run way back to this. Back. Can't handle it. It's off the mound. Jimmy Hickman is going to take the turn. He's challenging the arm of Clemente. He's going to go to third. He is saved.
I run just as hard as anybody else. Maybe I don't get there quite as fast, but I do have that stride, and I guess that'll be with me the rest of my career.
That's it. Here she goes. Back. Hey! Hickman did it again.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. As I said, Jim Hickman was from Henning, Tennessee. He was a very nice guy, and he loved country music, as I remember. So in tribute to Jim Hickman, we're going to play music from a little way up the road in Nashville. One of my favorites from a Nashville guy, Eddie Rabbitt.
I'm in a Nashville bar, and I've never been so far from that old gravel road and the rivers that run through my memory. Rocky Mountain music fills my memory. Rocky Mountain